Hello, welcome or welcome back to my channel. This is a recent read and I recently finished 3 books and I'm excited to talk about all of these books. So I'm going to start with this. This is LA Woman by Babitz. I actually started reading this book I would say a month ago, and even though it has only 160 pages, it took me a long time to read. So what is this book about? So LA Woman is about this young woman named Sophie Lubin who grew up in Los Angeles. And this book recounts her experience as a young woman since she's a young girl all the way until she's in her 20s in Los Angeles in the 1960s. And we get to learn about who she is as a person, and we would eventually learn that she's a bit of I would say, a certain personality. Now, whether you want to say that her personality is interesting or not, your mileage may vary. But Sophie Lubin is this, she sort of describes herself as someone who is not particularly intelligent. She is beautiful, yes, but at the same time she is also quite aimless. She doesn't have a particular ambition. She just goes from one thing to the next. Whatever that comes to her life, she just does it. And so she ends up having some small career in show business, and then she would end up being a groupie for Jim Morrison. At some point she also ends up becoming a photographer and all of that. So that sounds like an interesting book. But unfortunately, I did not enjoy this at all. When I first started this book, I thought that the first few pages were very interesting because the kind of voice that is employed in this book. So this book uses a first-person POV narrative. So Sophie Lubin narrates her own story. So basically, through her story, we learn that she was born to a fairly privileged family with a father who is a fairly accomplished musician, or someone who works doing music. And so her family is pretty well off, or at least have the means, but we're dealing with a protagonist who is someone that doesn't particularly have a certain drive or motivation or target in her life. And honestly, I thought that this was really interesting because there are so many things that a fiction could explore in regards to a protagonist that is like this. But unfortunately, this book is severely bogged down by a severe lack of organization. I thought that this book is terribly messy. The entire book is narrated by Sophie, the protagonist, and you end up with a book that feels like a series of stream of consciousness that initially reads like some kind of introspective things, but eventually it feels more and more like word vomit. once in a while, you would get glimpses of brilliance in the prose. Like I said, this character is also written as someone who is not particularly bright, and so there's this kind of apparent ditziness associated with this character, and we get to see that from the voice, the narrative voice as well. But once in a while, you would hear some interesting or wise things, or certain gems, word gems, being spewed out in the book. But other than that, for the most part, I would say this book needs a lot of editing. It also features tons of characters, tons of side characters, which and those characters are usually Sophie's friends and family and people that she ends up encountering in her life. But those characters, some, such as the family members, they are present, but at the same time they are present in a way that feels very kind of fleeting, or sometimes kind of intangible. And what I mean by that is that they just don't feel concrete as characters. We know that they are the family members, for example, or friends of Sophie, but they're just there, but they don't feel important to be there. And there are also many other side characters who just appear and then leave. They just sort of come and go, and they don't seem to serve a lot of significance to the story itself. They don't seem to serve a lot of much significant impact on the development of the character, perhaps. They just seem very inconsequential, and I find that particularly annoying. Now, as for the plot of this book, I would say I don't really need a book to be to have a very clear, strong plot. That is not really necessary. But in this book, because of the form that it takes, and that is this rambly stream of consciousness prose, it also jumps through time, which is fine, non-linear chronologically, but it doesn't feel like it has a certain point to it. It feels, again, in terms of what the story is trying to convey, it also feels kind of inconsequential. I get this feeling that this book, one of the intention in its storytelling is to convey the idea of what it is to be the LA woman. And this book attempts to sort of, in a very tongue-in-cheek way, define LA woman through who Sophie Lubin is. But at the same time, I just don't feel like it does a great job in really showing us its own definition of what LA woman is, because it just seems kind of flimsy. The writing, the plot, the characters who are supposed to support the story, who is supposed to make the story more solid, they just don't serve their function, and therefore this entire book just kind of feels like very wobbly to me, and I just don't feel any sense of attachment to anything. I don't feel any sense of emotional. I don't get any. I don't produce any emotional response to anything in this book. Everything just feels so flat, monotonous. And that is why I did not enjoy this book at all. I was kind of disappointed because I've heard a lot of good things about Eve Babitz, but maybe I made the wrong choice. Maybe I should have read her nonfiction instead, because apparently she's quite well known for her nonfiction works. And when I read through some of the reviews for this book, I would say many of the reviewers say similar things as well. That this, especially the ones who criticized this book, they also thought that this book is quite weak in the sense that it tries to do what the nonfiction does, but somehow it falls flat. And another thing is that it seems like the character Sophie Lubin is based on the writer herself. And even without without knowing who the writer is before, or without having read her nonfiction, I have this feeling also that this character feels weirdly intimate. Like there's something that feels voyeuristic from my point of view as I was reading this book, and as I was reading about the character. I feel like I was peering into the life of the author, and so it just had that vibe. It was kind of strange. It was interesting, but unfortunately the book itself, the writing, it just didn't work for me. So yeah, 1 out of 5 stars. So I'm gonna move on to the next book that I finished, and this one is Your Name Shall Be Tanga. And this book was written by French Cameroonian author Calixthe Beyala. It was originally written in French, and it was translated into English by Marjolijn the Jager. And this book, I would say I quite enjoyed. Now, similar to LA Woman, this book is also quite short. It has like 137 pages, and because it was September, I intended to read this book as part of Shorty September. And just like any books that I intended for Shorty September, I expected those books to be fairly quick reads. But just like LA Woman, this was not a quick read also. But this was not a quick read for a totally different reason. So what is this book about? This book centers around 2 women who are being placed in a filthy jail cell in a West African country. So one of the women is named Anna Claude, and she's a white foreign woman, a Jewish woman who ends up in that country for a particular reason. And she is in that jail cell because she is accused of being having certain kind of madness. She is accused of being mad or mentally unwell, and so she is placed in that jail cell. And the other woman, who has been accused of a great crime, her name is Tanga, and she's a local woman. And Tanga, she is dying, and as she is dying, she begins to recount the story of her life to this white foreign woman, Anna Claude. And at first, both of these women are just kind of distant from each other because they come from different backgrounds. But as Tanga tells the story to Anna Claude, their bond becomes closer. And before Tanga tells her story to Anna Claude, Tanga tells Anna Claude to let herself be called as Tanga in order for that story to, I would say, to flow. And as she recounts her story, we learn more about the life of Tanga before she ends up in that prison. And her life is a particularly traumatic one because since a kid, she has been pushed into the world of prostitution due to the poverty that affects her family. And we also learn that her parents, especially her mom, really is the one responsible to into making her as a prostitute. And we also learned that the women before her, her mom and her grandmother, were also prostitutes, and they all did this in order to survive. Nonetheless, there was nothing that can be considered loving in Tanga's family. Her mom basically abuses her and expects her to provide for her family, while asking her to continue selling herself, and at the same time expecting to be fed from her, but at the same time also shaming her for doing the things that she does. And so this book is quite difficult to read, because much of the things written in this book are very difficult for me to sort of see. And the way that plenty of the cruelty that are being portrayed in this book are being written in a way that is quite vivid. The language used, I would say, is quite metaphorical. It's poetic in a way, and it's kind of beautiful. But it is beautiful in showing something ugly, and so there's this kind of contrast between how I feel about the language versus how I feel about the content of the book. So in that sense, I would say this book is quite effective in showing the struggle that the main character Tanga has in her life. And there's in one of the recurrent theme, I would say, in this book is, of course, the struggle to reach a better kind of life. And how is better defined in this book? Well, maybe it's better if you have more money, or maybe it's better if you have love, or maybe it's better if you have a healthy relationship or whatnot. What exactly is better in this in life, especially in the context of the life of a woman who has been plagued with poverty and is pushed to doing something against her will. And so I thought this book was really beautiful. Now, if you are interested in reading this book, however, I, of course, based on what I've mentioned earlier, there are going to be some triggering contents. There are going to be a lot of sexual violence, a lot of physical violence as well, a lot of dehumanization going on in this book, a lot of, I would say, filthy things, either physically or spiritually, things that could be quite disturbing to read. And these things are described in this vivid metaphorical language, and some of them can be quite graphic. So yeah, just heads up if you are interested in this book. But definitely, I think this book was a great book, and I definitely recommend everyone to try it if you are comfortable with it. So I give this one 4 out of 5 stars. Wonderful. Now, for the last book I want to talk about in this video, I have Journeys Through Shadows by Indonesian author Dewi Anggraeni. I found that this book is probably not very well known, because when I look at Goodreads, apparently this book only had 4 ratings. and it doesn't have any review. Until I gave my own, now it has 1 review. So, but after reading this book, I thought that this book was really, was really fun to read. So what is Journeys Through Shadows about? This book is about an Indonesian woman who lives in Australia with her Australian husband. This Indonesian woman's name is Mariati, and she comes from a poor background, and she is illiterate. But she ends up encountering a white Australian man, Trevor, who falls in love with her, and she ends up moving to Australia and live with him in that country. But Mariati has something in her past, and that is she had a child with a white tourist, with a white Australian tourist, before she met Trevor. And this child, she has been keeping it secret from Trevor because she's afraid that Trevor is going to think that she's an unrespectable woman for having a child outside of wedlock before their marriage. But this has been distressing her, and she ends up seeing the apparition of a toil when they live in Australia, which to me is kind of interesting. A toil is actually a kind of ghost that appear in Malay folklore, Malay or Indonesian folklore, and usually a toil it comes in the form of a tiny kid, and typically it is created from black magic with aborted fetuses. So that's kind of like the history of this tiny ghost. And Mariati ends up seeing this ghost everywhere in Australia, and it's causing her to break down. And so this book sort of follows what happens after that. What is the decision that Mariati ends up taking as she's breaking down, and how is she going to deal with the possible consequences of her having kept the secret from her husband. And at the same time, there's also a B plot in this book, which involves Mariati's friend in Australia, who is also an Indonesian woman, who sort of is kind of caught in her own personal drama. She is a bit more, I would say, she's a bit more liberal compared to Mariati's, who is a bit more conservative. This friend, Annie, she is liberal in the sense that she has a relationship that is not bound by marriage. But something is going to happen as a consequence of this. And that something is going to have to do with black magic as she returns to Indonesia. Anyway, I hope that doesn't sound too convoluted. Now, one thing I particularly like about this book is the language used is not particularly embellished. It doesn't use a lot of ornaments, doesn't use a lot of too much, I would say, flowery language that would end up making it feel pretentious. And therefore, I really like this, this simplistic approach to storytelling that it has, which makes it feel quite honest. It makes it feel very straightforward, and best of all, it makes it feel like this book does not hold any pretension. It doesn't feel like, this book doesn't feel like it's trying to be something bigger or something grand. It doesn't have an expectation of grandeur, and I like that. Now, the second thing that I like is that I like how this book just casually weaves fantastical elements into its world of realism. It just casually includes stuff like toils, the ghost, and also black magic into its storyline. And the characters, most of the characters, just sort of accept these things as the things that happen. And much of the plot is driven partly by these elements also. And there is this, and there is no, this book doesn't try to make the reader feel like these things are out of place. It just organically includes all these elements and expect readers to, well, perhaps suspend their disbelief, maybe, but it doesn't seem to care so much about, what the readers feel. It just considers these things as part of the realism. And I like that. And that is what I usually consider as magical realism. Because, and I also realize that this is the kind of magical realism that I like. Very similar to the kind of magical realism that I discovered in Latin American fiction, where, the fantastical things, they just sort of exist, and people just sort of treat it as part of the fabric of reality. And this is something that happens in here also, and I also noticed it happening in other Indonesian works as well, where the characters don't suddenly feel like these things are out of place, and they don't point out the fact that these things are totally magical or whatever. And I like it. And the reason why I like it also is because this is kind of like how people in, I wouldn't say not all, I would say not all people here, but this is also how some people who live in this region that I live in right now views things, views their life. Like if someone just say that a certain person has been afflicted by black magic, then the response is not necessarily going to be one of skepticism, but rather something more pragmatic, like, okay, so that person is afflicted with black magic, so who should we contact? Like, which shaman should we go to? Like, which doctor should we find? There are a lot of people around me would still have this kind of response to these kinds of happening. And these are exactly the kind of response that I'm seeing being portrayed in this book also. So, I like that. I appreciate that portrayal of reality is being shown in a book, and especially in a foreign language, such as an English language. And that is why I appreciate this book a lot. I would say this book also has its own flaws, like perhaps, just perhaps, maybe the story could need a little bit more polishing and a bit more meat. I think the story of this book would probably would have felt a bit more punchy and epic if it were thicker, if there were more details included in the story, making the characters more real, more fleshed out. Not that they are not fleshed out in this book right now, but they could have felt a bit more meaningful, a bit more emotionally full. But the book that I'm holding right now is quite entertaining, and it's also quite political also, which is another aspect that is kind of surprising with this book. It is particularly political in regards to the lives of Indonesian women and the intersectionality that happens between gender, race, nationality, and also wealth. And it doesn't insert the politics in a the politics is not inserted in a very heavy-handed way, but rather it feels organic. Once in a while, you're gonna get it in the right place, in the right places, and overall, it's a nice book with its own set of imperfections, but still, reading this book was a nice experience. Anyway, I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. So those are all of the books that I'm currently that I finished, and let me just talk about books that I'm currently reading right now, very briefly. I just started reading this book. This one is by Diane. This is The New Wilderness. And I'm also currently reading this historical fiction by Malaysian author. It's called The Storm We Made by Vanessa Chan. This book is set in Malaya during the occupation of during the Japanese occupation. I am also in the middle of reading The Leopard by Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa, translated from Italian to English by Archibald Colquhoun. And I am reading Artful by Alice Smith, and partly because I want to read something by Alice Smith. It has been quite a while, but also because in September there is an event called Framed in September, organized by 5, I think, booktubers. And it is a reading event in which you read something related to arts. So, and I think this book really fits that criteria. And so far, I am loving this book so much. It is a book that talks, that ruminates about art and all especially the written works. And you know what, to be honest, reading this book right now, even though I'm enjoying it, I also feel stupid reading this book. I feel so stupid reading this book. Like, yeah. Explain that. You know, that contradiction. Enjoying something but also feeling stupid when reading it. Anyway, those are the books that I'm currently reading. Let me know what you are currently reading. Let me know if you have read any of these books that I've read. Let me know if you have any other recommendation related to these books, or if you have any thoughts about any of these books at all. Let me know how your day is like. Anyway, I'll see you again in a new video. So until then, take care. Thanks for watching, and bye.